He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Media Watch, back for 2026. I'm Colin Peacock. In this election year, the economy will be talked about a lot by our politicians and our media, and any signs of green shoots or growth will be seized upon by both. But after several tough years for media businesses, there's green shoots in business news, it seems. We ask a business editor about that, and also why his own publication is currently confronting its own customers to force them to pay more for it.
Ultimately, people who are doing this are stealing from us, and if people continue to steal news content, then you'll just see more of what we've seen in New Zealand over the last couple of years, which frankly is just media companies going bust. So in order for people to continue to support news and for news to exist in New Zealand, we need to pay for it.
It's a kind of copyright crusade, the outcome of which other local media with online subscribers will be watching closely. But first, the story and the issue that's dominated the news here this new year, the wild weather which brought death and devastation to the north last week. It was extreme, but these days not unexpected. We look at how the media handled that, and also claims that it isn't yet time to talk about the politics of it or climate change.
I look at our protectors, our maunga around us, and there's huge slips, gashing them. They look like open gash wounds. One of our whānau described it was just like a movie, It's just unreal. It's just something you might see on the TV.
That was Trudy Nawhare, a Civil Defence Incident Management Leader, describing the damage in Te Araroa on the East Cape on RNZ's checkpoint last Monday after the devastating wind, rain and flooding late last week. And this, on News Talk ZB's news on Thursday last week, also painted a pretty vivid picture.
A helicopter has plucked 7 people from a roof in Punuruku near East Cape during rising floodwaters. It follows civil defence officials in Te Araroa telling whānau to tie their tamariki to themselves until wait for rescue.
The disaster movie type scenes that Trudy Nawhare described also played out on our TV news and all over the news media, from Northland, Coromandel, elsewhere in Tairāwhiti and the Bay of Plenty. And there was lots more in the news media and, of course, on social media, where what went out was not always as accurately and honestly presented as we'll hear. And in Mount Maunganui, it wasn't just the scars of storm damage on the hillsides. The collapse of Moao onto the Beachlands campground was catastrophic, traumatic and deadly for 6 campers. Eyewitness Alistair Hardy gave TVNZ News phone footage of a slip that he filmed hours earlier, and this chilling account of that.
So I looked over to my right and I saw more. There was another slip actually occurring. So I got out my phone and started taking photos of that, and then I realised that there were people still trying to get around the track, and there were people above the slip trying to walk across.
That prompted Mr Hardy to warn some campers and authorities, which helped save some lives, but he also told One News about feeling helpless when disaster struck.
So all of a sudden there was just a mighty cracking, and yeah, that happened. Yeah.
Another who raised the alarm was Morrinsville teacher Lisa McLennan. The Herald vividly described how she woke up many holidaymakers at 5 a.m. to warn them of the possibility of a looming landslide, but tragically she didn't live to tell the media about it herself. Newspapers carried vivid images of the slip that was shot from above from drones or helicopters, but perhaps the starkest image in our media this past week was the front page of the Bay of Plenty Times newspaper on Monday. It bore the names of Lisa McLennan and 5 other known victims in white on a stark black background, and a quote from the statement issued by the iwi Ngāti Ranginui. Those who have passed now become part of the sacred fabric of our maunga. Their wairua will rest forever beneath the mantle of Moao, protected and embraced for all time. Now, along with neighbouring Ngāti Rangi and Ngāti Pūkenga, Ngāti Ranginui administers the maunga through the Moao Trust, and both the Prime Minister and Māori Affairs Minister and Associate Housing Minister Tama Pōtaka acknowledged and thanked them all for their support of people who were displaced and traumatised and their help with the recovery. But on social media, the iwi found themselves accused of contributing to the catastrophe. And the Prime Minister's response to that led 3 News on Monday night.
Welcome to 3 News. Some relief in Mount Maunganui today as recovery efforts resumed, but also a day of disappointment as the Prime Minister had to shut down what he called racist misinformation over the role of iwi in the landslide.
Online posts have been speculating about whether the removal of trees seen behind me here on Mawao in recent years for protection of culturally significant sites and for restoration purposes contributed to the landslide.
I'm aware there's a lot of misinformation and stuff going on out there. There always is in circumstances like this.
Luxon quickly shutting down those online comments.
The people on the margins with their rhetoric, they just need to, frankly, keep it to themselves.
Now, Christopher Luxon didn't name names there, but Cameron Whale Oil Slater said on X that the landslides may have been the result of co-governance of the Mount. Māori demanded removal of large non-native trees recently at the main slip site, he alleged. Alternative news sites online also aired claims that the deadly landslide was avoidable and sparked by the council's removal of stabilising trees at the iwi's insistence. And several cited the analysis of a retired civil engineer named Rod Kane, who claimed 20 years of experience in slope stability and remediation. But the same Rod Kane has in the past also been highly critical online about co-governance and Māorification of events, including Anzac Day. And on his own Facebook page this week, Mr Kane said this.
It's now fairly evident that the Tauranga Council, at the insistence of iwi in using ratepayers' money, removed big trees in the area of the slip simply because they were colonial. This is where superstition, stupidity and cultural arrogance hits the brick wall.
Rod Kane went on to warn on Facebook of what he called fake tribalists and 12th century spiritual nonsense, encouraged by what he called stupid governments and councils and the media. Clearly, it wasn't just geotechnical evidence informing Mr Kane's opinions about the deadly landslide late last week. But important questions were raised in the media by experts with no apparent ethnic axis to grind. Under the headline, Did Tree Removal Really Trigger the Mount Maunganui Landslide?, Dr Andrew Stalter from the University of Auckland's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering told Stuff, not really. Removing trees could contribute to instability, he said, but also tree roots may not be deep enough to control a deep, fast-moving slip like that one. Extreme weather and soil conditions were the big factors, he said, and so did Professor Ewan Mason from the University of Canterbury, who unequivocally told Stuff the removal of trees in 2022 and 23 would not be the sole reason for this tragedy. University of Auckland Professor of Applied Geology Martin Brooke also told the Herald Now show this.
The surface of it is riddled by past landslides which have occurred. Some recently in the last couple of decades, but also some long before European settlement.
And Martin Brooke followed that up with an article for the academic online news site The Conversation, which was widely republished in our media this week, in which he said that the campsite itself was built on layers deposited by previous slips long ago. Now, Moao may have been a disaster waiting to happen in extreme weather, but not solely for the reasons that the non-expert keyboard warriors were claiming on Facebook. Once the emergency had subsided, politicians might ponder the benefit of people getting their information about this from professional and accountable news outlets and not scattergun blurts on social media where there's no recourse at all for falsehoods and bad faith opinions. Now, coincidentally, last Wednesday, ACT MP Laura McClure lodged a members' bill to scrap the state-backed agency which upholds standards in broadcasting, the Broadcasting Standards Authority, which operates under pre-internet era legislation. In a free country, the ultimate broadcasting standard is the judgment of the audience, the ACT Party said in its announcement of McClure's move, which would mean that broadcasters couldn't be held to account at all. And on News Talk ZB, Ryan Bridge asked her this.
How do you make sure that people have some kind of news that they can sort of loosely trust? And I know...
Yeah.
I know there aren't many who trust mainstream media outlets anymore anyway. But you know what I'm saying? Like when something big happens, you go to a trusted source. Do you not need some regulation for that?
And that's a good question at a time when something big had just happened and irresponsible claims about it were being floated, as we heard. Her answer was this.
Given the fact that people are consuming media in all kinds of different places, it really is unfair for mainstream media to have to adhere or comply to essentially paying levies. I mean, they have barely any complaints realistically. But I do think it is important for people to have oversight and trust and accountability, and I think that we've got enough there.
But what Laura McClure didn't mention there is that broadcasters draw up those standards that they uphold along with the BSA, and those standards mirror their own editorial principles and guidelines. If her bill is drawn from the ballot, MPs will have to decide if extending the fact-free free-for-all of the internet to broadcasting is really in the interests of New Zealanders, most of whom, when surveyed, have said they do want news they can trust. After last week's tragedy, it was probing journalism which revealed that warnings were missed in Mount Maunganui, emergency calls apparently mishandled, and opportunities to save lives possibly squandered. For example, under the headline, "Should warnings have been seen?", the Weekend Post had 6 senior journalists on the case for that: Mike White, Nikki MacDonald, Andrea Vance, Katie Hunter, Dina Costa and Henry Cook. And the Post's National Affairs editor Andrea Vance concluded there was no system to escalate the response in place and critical information stayed in silos. And Andrea Vance summed it up like this.
This is not a freak event in an unknowable place. Moau has a documented landslide history stretching back more than a century.
Last Tuesday, RNZ's Phil Pennington revealed that after a big storm in 2005, geotechnical engineers told Tauranga City Council that buildings should not be in those run-out zones that might be inundated in a slip unless they had been specially protected. But the Prime Minister was not alone in being surprised to be told this week that landslides have killed more Kiwis in our history than any other natural hazard.
Personally, I had no idea until this week that landslides kill more people in New Zealand than any other natural disaster. But as the changing climate makes these big weather events and storms much more common, the question of liability is going to become more prescient than ever.
That was fill-in News Talk ZB host Jack Tame last Monday, and while prescient wasn't quite the right word there, he wasn't wrong about liability.
And it is my hunch that many councils and landowners around the country will be looking at the terrible events in Mount Maunganui and realising that actually their own systems for assessing real-time landslide risk are woefully inadequate. Tauranga Council hopes to have the terms of reference and more detail about the independent inquiry confirmed later this week. But just as Pike River was a catalyst for huge health and safety law reforms, the Mount Maunganui disaster is fast shaping up as a watershed moment for property owners and councils when it comes to liability around the country.
And whether it is in the end or not, the media will have a role in that. But this week, Jack Tame's peers in the media were not so hopeful that inertia would not win out.
You know, there is going to be an inquiry. There needs to be an inquiry. That's becoming clear at every single news bulletin, it seems. But what worries me, and I've seen this too many times with reports into disasters and faults over the last few years, Phil Pennington's usually doing the reports, that these things, they don't get acted on properly, or they don't get implemented, or it's taken too long, or they say they're implementing stuff and then it drags and it gets lost in bureaucracy. That's what worries me, and I do want to see some energy and some focus on making sure that there is plans and things done to deal with these, because we know there's more coming down the pipe.
RNZ's Morning Report host Corin Dan there on the political panel show The Whip last Wednesday, and that fear was echoed earlier by ZB host Andrew Dickens.
We've had this before, whether it's Pike River or Cave Creek or the Wahine. After a time has passed, we have a review, we get some ideas, but by that stage the heat has gone out of the argument. Will the lessons be heeded? And one lesson I have for you today is to trust your common sense the way Lisa McLennan did. She could see what was happening in front of her own eyes. If you're concerned, say something. And maybe you should not just blindly trust your fellow citizens who say, yeah, sweet, it's never happened before, don't worry about it.
Well, it's hard to argue with any of that. Coincidentally, Andrew Dickens was saying that on ZB last Monday on the 3rd anniversary of the Auckland Anniversary Day floods, when lives were lost and homes wrecked in a sudden unprecedented downpour that also caught out councils and emergency services. And when Cyclone Gabrielle was bearing down on Hawke's Bay and Coromandel just days later, it was the biggest names on that same radio network who were telling listeners not to worry about it, even condemning school closures and evacuation warnings as fear-driven overreactions.
So what we've done is whip ourselves into this extraordinary frenzy. I'm listening to your mate Chris from the Met Service. He's now talking about 100k winds as being like a hurricane.
Well, he described it as ferocious.
Anyone who lives in Wellington, has lived in Wellington, 100k's is a breezy day.
And all the schools are closed in Hawke's Bay in Napier. Dear me.
Did we
really need to shut all the schools. I mean, I reserve the right to be wrong. If it comes in like a wrecking ball this afternoon, then, they were right and maybe it was just a bit slower than we thought. But I don't know.
Now, 3 years on, the last voice you heard there, Kate Hawkesby, is no longer on News Talk ZB. But after the catastrophe at Beachlands Campground, Mike Hosking was earnestly pondering whether this would end up changing where we build and live in New Zealand, but concluding it was a bit too soon after the tragedy for that discussion. But the other host you heard there, Kerry Woodham, did have that discussion on her ZB Talkback show last Tuesday after telling her listeners the deadly landslide was horrifying, but not unexpected.
In some instances, though, do we just need to acknowledge that we are no match for the power of nature, concede defeat and step away?
Several of Kerry Woodham's listeners got in touch to insist they reckoned it was too soon to ponder that sort of thing right now, and many more said the same of claims that the tragedy had been caused by climate change, including the Prime Minister, who told Morning Report this.
Yeah, I've talked about that for years, and I just think if you're a doubter of climate change having an impact on extreme weather events, I'd give that up because there's no doubt there's that connection.
And last weekend, the Otago Daily Times was even more blunt in its editorial headlined, "It's Climate Change Stupid." And while that wasn't directed at the Prime Minister, this bit of the editorial was.
Economy was mentioned 18 times in Christopher Luxon's State of the Nation speech this week, but climate change? Not once. It was a speech about wanting to ensure the best possible future for Kiwis, which completely ignored the most pressing issue.
The same day, the editorial in The Post was also unequivocal.
If you ask why this summer's been wetter than the golden Kiwi summers you remember, the answer is climate change. More specifically, it's about warming seas. There'll be some who say it's too soon to talk about climate change, while the search for bodies is ongoing. They'll say the commentary is politicising the tragedy. But the reality is that rather than too soon, it may be too late.
Tauranga City Council, which owns Beachlands Holiday Park, has commissioned its own review of last week's disaster, and having seen the damage up close for himself, the Prime Minister was persuaded to propose a wider government one as well. And all that certainly will bring both last week's tragedies and the wider issues of climate change, adaptation and policy and planning all back into the news in the months ahead. And while arguments fade about the right time to talk about those things, all this will be done in the knowledge that what happened in Mount Maunganui and in Welcome Bay could happen almost anywhere in the country at almost any time. So the sooner we know more about what happened last week, the better. Last Wednesday on Midweek Media Watch, our weekly catch-up with Nights here on RNZ National, I looked at some other aspects of the coverage of that story and claims that what played out in the media and some parties had politicised it. We also talked about a shake-up in morning news on TV and radio that's underway, with more to come. If you missed it, Midweek Media Watch is available on our podcast page at rnz.co.nz or in our podcast feed, available wherever you get your podcasts. And as part of that morning news rejig, there will be not one, but two new early morning TV shows dedicated to business news. And that's a bit of a throwback to the days of ASB Business on TV3, hosted for years by Michael Wilson, and Business Breakfast on TV1, launched in 2008 by a newcomer to TV called Corin Dan.
Well, good morning. Welcome to the first NZI Business. We're very excited to be bringing you the program in partnership with NZI Insurance.
Now, some of these upcoming changes in morning TV news have been driven in part by the fact that there's an election coming up, and that is likely to be heavily influenced by, or according to some pundits, determined by, the state of our economy. On Tuesday, Prime Minister Christopher Luxon told Morning Report he was delighted that parts of the media were reporting economic good news now.
Well, I think you've seen even the media, I think even Radio New Zealand might even report positively on some of the positive economic news that we've had in the last 2 months, which is fantastic of you. But I want people to start to feel that and to see that.
And shortly we'll ask a business editor how to sift the spin from the economic substance in an election year, but also reporting in a way that pleased the Prime Minister was stuff in early January, under a headline echoing National's own election year slogan, rebuilding the economy by fixing the basics and building the future. Now, this stuff story was studded with pictures of the Prime Minister and his Finance Minister smiling, and it painted a very rosy economic picture. But this wasn't really news. It was tagged as sponsored content, and an advertisement by the New Zealand National Party funded by the Parliamentary Service. Now that's a bit of handy income for Stuff from the public purse, but not so great perhaps for its claims to offer independent journalism that people can trust. This paid-for political puff piece on the 5th of January claimed the economy is expected to grow at 3% next year, while inflation remains low. But soon after came the news that inflation had topped 3% again, and it was a different story on TVNZ's breakfast show last Monday.
To tell us more about this, we are joined by Infometrics CEO Brad Olsen. Brad, good morning to you. Happy New Year.
Same to you.
3.1%, this is obviously above the target band for the RBNZ. Was this slightly unexpected?
Well, it wasn't that economist Brad Olsen wasn't expecting the question there. That was just a technical hitch. But meanwhile, the Prime Minister's warm words for the mainstream media about sharing good economic news were not echoed by his coalition partner, David Seymour. He told ACT Party supporters in a fundraising plea this week,
"We're not willing to rely on legacy media to tell our story for us. That's why I'm asking you to chip in today."
Coincidentally, one media outlet has also been strongly urging some of its customers to chip in more lately, and that's NBR, the country's longest-lasting business news outlet. And other news media companies with paying customers are watching this move with interest. When COVID upended the news business in 2020, NBR became an online-only publication, so nothing on the newsstands anymore, with a cover price. Maverick owner Todd Scott, formerly a sales guy at NBR, also made the bold move to drop all advertising, and ever since, NBR has relied entirely on revenue from paying customers with online subscriptions, and that includes individuals, as well as companies and institutions and government departments, big and small. Subscribers with a big staff wanting NBR access are required to take out a more substantial subscription, but as is common with subscriptions, some of the online content is shared around from a small number of logins, or in some cases, just one. Last year, Todd Scott and NBR warned that they would take inland revenue to court for breach of copyright because they knew that was going on there. And just before Christmas, the NBR political editor Brent Edwards said this was about more than just copyright.
That it's Inland Revenue Department. I mean, this is the department that makes us pay our taxes in it. So you think what they've done there with their breach of copyright, they used to have 220 subscriptions. They cut it back to one early in 2024, but then used that subscription to share articles with other people, including in one case, several articles with up to 600 people. So they were kind of getting it on the cheap, but still wanting the same service. Now, if you or I did something similar to try and avoid or evade tax, they'd come down on you like a ton of bricks.
Now, tax dodging is clearly not quite the same crime as subscription maximising, but the point was clear. IRD apologised, but has actually refused to pay NBR or settle. Since then, NBR has also stopped subscribers copying, printing or saving articles to PDF to get around the paywall, and it's blocked and named and shamed Macquarie Bank and Sky City for sharing paywalled articles around from a single subscription and login. NBR recently reported that 4 firms have settled financially with them over this, and it says its subscriptions are up 10% in a year. Other media outlets with paywalls who know some of their paying clients are not really paying enough will now be wondering if the same tactic might work for them. But how far will NBR go to get settlements and subscriptions from scroogey companies? And will confronting customers like this really pay off in the long run? Those are questions I put to NBR co-editor Hamish McNichol.
All of those settlements that we've talked about so far have included commitments to buy the appropriate number of subs as well for those organisations, but we've also had a number of firms coming forward, increasing their numbers. That sort of ranges from much bigger firms ramping up how many they have to a bunch of smaller firms going from sort of 5 to 10, that sort of thing as well. So,
surely some must have resented being told off or told how to use the content they thought they were paying for and, scrap their subs, or told you that they might do that in the future?
We haven't had any of that yet. We've not had a raft of cancellations of people annoyed with what we're doing here.
How do you even know? How do you gauge the volume of this unjustified sharing by your customers?
We've got a system which tracks what individual subscribers are reading. So where we see evidence of one account being used to read the same story multiple times, we can then do a bit of a deeper investigation using our tech provider, which sort of looks at whether that's just someone who is really interested in one story and looking at it over and over again, or if the reason why that story has been read multiple times is because an account or a login is being shared by multiple people. So there's a couple of ways that we can check that sort of activity. The other ways that we've been finding out about this as well, though, is, for instance, with Sky City, which you mentioned earlier, someone actually leaked us evidence of emails being sent internally within that company containing copy and pasted PDFs of our articles, which were sent out to staff. And with the IRD, in 2024, they went down from 220 subs down to just one, which obviously raised a few alarm bells for us. We confronted them about their usage sort of middle of last year, and they basically came back and put their hands up and said, yep, here's all the times in the last 18 months that we've been sharing your articles with just one login. And as you mentioned with Brent's article, there was 7 instances where articles had been shared with 600 staff, which, is egregious, really.
And it was leaked to you. Maybe those people didn't think they were doing anything wrong. Surely, if they received an interesting article, sent it to a colleague, another one sent, they might have thought, well, that's the purpose of having a subscription, to be able to, as if it was on display in our library or our lunchroom on the premises.
Yeah, and a lot of what we have taken action against is not just people sharing an article that they've been interested in with their friend or their dad or something like that. It's been this mass copying and pasting of articles into documents which are then distributed among many staff, hundreds on occasion. So that's really what we're sort of targeting here. The focus has really been on these really egregious cases where it's very obvious that you've just got one sub and yet you're sharing it with dozens, hundreds of people sometimes.
Is that, legally speaking, actually a breach of copyright law, or kind of merely, although irritating to you, a violation of the terms and conditions of the actual subscription agreement?
No, it's both. A copyright notice on our site says all content on this website is copyright NBR and cannot be reproduced in any form without permission. So that's very clear. And then also our terms and conditions state that an individual NBR account is for a single person and therefore cannot be set up under a generic email address that is accessed by multiple people, cannot be transferred to another user, and cannot be shared with others. Sharing with others is a breach of copyright. So it's both, and it's very, very clear.
As an editor, is it a bit tricky reporting this? There's obvious conflict of interest or self-interest in reporting this. Is there a risk that your reporting and your coverage ends up being a form of kind of special pleading where you're naming and shaming your bad customers, but it's all because you want more money coming in?
Sure, and we've had some discussions within the newsroom about this. We've been very clear with our publishers, Todd and Jackie Scott, about the importance of editorial independence during this process. When we first started announcing these actions or these settlements, we did it through the media first, through press release. As it sort of evolved and gone on, we've started to do our own stories on this as well. Look, we're confident our reporting has been straight down the line. We've adhered to all the normal practice. Yes, we are writing about ourselves. Yes, there is a self-interest, but it's sort of up to the reader to decide. We're not trying to pretend that it's not.
But as an example, sorry to interrupt you, but you have, for example, your political editor, Brent Edwards, sitting down doing a video interview with your own journalist, Jonathan Mitchell, and Brent Edwards is saying, look, the IRD, imagine them behaving like this when they're the outfit that makes you pay your tax and so on. Tax evasion or dodging, that's not in the same league as, maxing your subscription, is it really?
Well, our point with the IRD is, they crack down on people who are not paying their fair share, and so we're doing the exact same with them. Brent Edwards, I don't think I've met a more ethical person in my life than Brent. It is understandable that it could create the self-interest, conflict of interest impression. We've not heard that criticism from anybody yet, from our subscribers or from outside. And like I say, we are approaching this very carefully and making sure that we are doing everything by the book.
Engaging lawyers is expensive, going to court even more so. In the end, this might end up, actually costing you more than it brings in. How far are you actually prepared to go to pursue some of these people for what you regard as fair payment?
All the settlements we've achieved so far have included payment of our legal costs. The only one that's live at the moment is IRD because we haven't been able to reach a settlement with them, so we're still on the hook for legal costs there, and if that does go to court action, then obviously that'll cost a lot of money as well. the cases that we've taken so far have all been cut and dry in our view. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the corporates have come back, or most of the entities have come back and sort of said, yep, we're in the wrong here, we'll make it right. How far we go, I mean, it's how far we upturn this bad behaviour, really. We're certainly not slowing down anytime soon, and are determined to keep monitoring and keep calling it out where we see it.
So the NBR versus IRD is still alive.
Yeah, we still haven't been able to reach a settlement with them. I suppose there's a chance some of those we've taken action against might, a year from now, reduce their subs, or they'll sort of remember this in the future, as it were. But they've been sharing our stories inappropriately. They're clearly interested enough in what we're writing about to share it with their team members. So long as we keep doing good work, they will continue to read it. They just need to pay for it. Again, I think our publishers, Todd and Jackie, deserve a lot of credit for having the bravery to do this in a small market like New Zealand. It needs to be done, and I think all the other publishers with paywalls or these sorts of models in New Zealand should be taking note and should be being encouraged by what we're trying to do here as well. One of the firms we took on this stuff cited Netflix as an example and said, well, everyone shares their Netflix subscription, so why is it any different for you guys? And Netflix is one of the largest media companies in the world. NBR is a small privately owned business in New Zealand. Ultimately, people who are doing this are stealing from us, and if people continue to steal news content, then you'll just see more of what we've seen in New Zealand over the last couple of years, which frankly is just media companies going bust. So in order for people to continue to support news and for news to exist in New Zealand, we need to pay for it.
TVNZ and the Herald both have plans to fairly soon reintroduce business news shows on TV and in video at sort of 6:30 in the morning, prior to breakfast TV news. It's a bit like going back to the days of the ASB Business Show on TV3, which ran for years, and the breakfast business news on TV1. Do you think this is a good thing and people will watch?
I think it's a good thing. I mean, clearly we value business news, and anything which brings that to the masses is a good thing.
Will you watch it?
No. I am getting ready to jump on a train about that time to come into work, so I just don't have the time. But also around that time I'm scanning sort of international headlines, and I don't know. The question for me is what types of business journalism these shows are going to focus on. Is it going to be sort of thorough, deep dive business news and analysis, markets coverage, overnight action from the US markets and commodities and things like that? Or is it going to be what we've increasingly seen in terms of mainstream media business coverage, more sort of personal finance type stuff, interest rates, KiwiSaver, that sort of stuff, all incredibly important, but probably less relevant to a business audience or an audience which is really focused on business news. Really rate Garth Bray, who's been appointed for the Herald Now show, and he's been doing a good job talking about what our colleagues over at Business Desk have been reporting about. So good early signs there. I had a look at the job description for the TVNZ show. Not entirely clear to me they know exactly what they're trying to achieve here, other than sort of garnering some commercial partnerships and stuff, which is fine. But I don't know. It is a good thing, I think, but I'm not sure what the focus is going to be.
Another thing on Morning Report this week caught my ear. Economist Cameron Bagri was being interviewed mainly about the impact and reasons for the inflation rate apparently topping 3% again. And he kind of volunteered this thought that that big companies don't get enough scrutiny here. This is what he said to Corin Dan on Morning Report.
Yeah, where I think there's not enough attention across New Zealand, we focus an awful lot on what's going on across the government. If you look at the mood of the boardrooms survey, pointed the finger pretty clearly at the politicians in regard to their economic management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we don't focus on enough there, Corin, is what's called the performance of the boardroom. We need to point the finger here a little bit more at the private sector in regard to turning the dial on AI technology and getting that productivity story up.
If you're saying the media and others should be putting more scrutiny on, what are the benchmarks that we should look for from our leading companies?
Well, just underlying performance. Unfortunately, we've seen across New Zealand over the past sort of few years the sort of destruction of an awful lot of capital, shareholder value. And ultimately, companies need to be accountable.
Is he right? Are the companies getting a kind of easy ride from business media like you?
He obviously doesn't have an NBR subscription. He writes a column for Business Desk, so I assume he has a subscription there, and they do lots of good stuff in this space. That sort of highlights what I was saying earlier about sort of the general retraction of business coverage by mainstream media outlets. There has been a real shift in focus to more personal finance sort of stuff. Some outlets now, you barely find any sort of listed coverage at all.
Yeah, also there's more commentary, isn't there, in business sections of columns by business journalists about cost of living and stuff like that often don't go into the nitty-gritty of certain industries or our big companies that Cameron Bradbury seems to think need more transparency.
Yeah, from NBR's perspective, we very closely cover certainly the NZX 50 and a lot of the smaller cap stocks on the NZX as well. We're constantly monitoring the professional services firms to see what they're up to and what they're seeing out in the market. Constantly talking to that end of town and pressing them and holding them to account. Several of the most recent FMA investigations into wrongdoing or alleged wrongdoing at several firms, Duval, Chance Voigt, which is a recent one, Senior Trust, countless others. There was the Validus case a couple of years ago, all spurred by, I would say, our reporting. Look, that said, we've got earnings season coming up in February. It's been a lot of reflection from listed companies about how tough things have been doing. Hopefully in the next little while, they'll start to be a bit more outward looking and start to talk about some of this stuff. From the perspective of sort of mainstream media coverage, I can understand where he's coming from, but I think we cover that stuff really well. We can always do more, but we need people paying for our journalism.
And finally, Hamish, it's election year. We get constant reminders about that, and maybe at this point of the year where these news programs are all coming back and pointing to it and emphasising that. Does an election year change the mission at all for NBR and its journalism, or is it almost literally business as usual for you?
No, obviously we're not going to be chasing the gallery pack around to every stand-up. We sort of are a bit more choosy about what we go to and what we cover, but we are going to be shortly launching a week-long series focusing broadly on what policies businesses want to see on the table at the election. We're also going to launch a new series this year as well, which interviews a bunch of sort of interesting business leaders or people influential in business about the sort of stuff that they want to see as well. It's also the 40th anniversary of the Rich List this year, and every year we ask the Rich Listers about politics and what they would like to see, but also scrutinise their donations to parties and stuff like that. So you can expect to see some coverage around that in June. I would make a broader point. I think New Zealand business leaders need to be a bit braver on some of this stuff. We're such a small country, everyone's so worried. If you say something negative about somebody, you'll see them across the table the very next week trying to do a deal with them or trying to do business with them. So I feel like a lot of business leaders in New Zealand are quite reluctant to really stick their neck out on issues or things that are really important to them. We're really this year trying to encourage a bit more of that. Obviously, a lot of scrutiny comes back in response to that, people saying, why do we care about what these people think? But frankly, they are very important and very influential in our society. And so I think even if you agree with what they do or don't want from a policy perspective, it's really important to understand what they are thinking about and what they do want. But yeah, apart from a small handful, I think most are a bit shy from commenting too much on politics, and I'd like to see a few more be a bit braver.
And we'll also see, in fact, we're already hearing it, the Prime Minister and his ministers constantly making the point that they say Labor, the previous regime, government kind of broke the economy. We're in the process of mending it and it's difficult. It kind of reminded J.D. Vance last week, the Vice President in the US, the same sort of thing. He was saying that the Democrats have broken it and they were trying to fix it.
And yes, there is an affordability crisis, one created by Joe Biden's policies. You don't turn the Titanic around overnight. It takes time to fix what was broken.
You don't turn the Titanic around overnight. I don't think was quite the form of words that should have made it to the teleprompter.
No.
But are you going to find that kind of wearing, that this blaming another source for the poor performance of the economy if it continues on?
We've had some conversations as well with business people privately or rich listers privately as well, where people are just sort of getting a bit sick of the negative sentiment constantly, sort of feeling that, the first couple of years of the coalition government was spent blaming the form a lot for what went wrong. one of the things they point to with someone like Sir John Key is that one of the things they really rated about him was how he was generally quite optimistic and willing to talk up a game and a big game as well. And I think that's what business wants to see. Is a lot of firms have just sort of got sick of waiting around for stuff to change for them and have just been sitting on their hands, and now they're sort of, this is the year where they're going to take action. But then, that said, the election cycle is not that far away from kicking into gear. On current polling, it's looking pretty uncertain, so that is not helpful for business at all. I mean, I think there is just a general feeling out there that we want to hear a bit more optimism, we want to see a bit more optimism, and that'll feed through into confidence for business and consumers alike.
Great. Well, we'll get you back later in the year to see how it's going, both your, what I've perhaps crudely called your copyright crusade, I don't know whether you like that or not, but also how it shapes up with the discussion of big economic issues and the election as the political heat goes up as well. But thanks so much for joining us today, Hamish McNichol.
Cheers, Colin.
Hamish McNichol from NBR there, the country's longest-lasting business news publication, which is currently, as you heard, on a kind of copyright crusade to get its own biggest subscribers to cough up more subscriptions rather than copying and sharing the content. And that's something that is of interest to all other media outlets here that have paywalls and subscribers who maximise what they can get from behind them in breach of the T's and C's of the subscription agreements. And finally on Media Watch this week, one news story in the summer that was a genuine surprise for most was the sudden sacking of the All Blacks coach. Though the new host of RNZ's Midday Report, Guy Espiner, noted last Monday that sports subs did rustle up a good headline when a possible replacement turned the job down soon after that.
This isn't my headline, by the way, but it's a good one. Stern Vern spurns the Fern.
Well done. He does indeed go on. Yes, Vern Cotter. He's ruled himself out of coaching the All Blacks.
Well done indeed, but for simplicity and elegance, it was hard to beat the headline on the RNZ News website when they were reporting that Scott Robinson was expecting to get the boot. Disposable razor was pretty stark, but clever and spot on. Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts for us or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediaWatchNZ on X. And you can even write us an old-fashioned letter and send it to Media Watch, P.O. Box 123, Wellington. Catch you again for Midweek Media Watch next Wednesday. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.